Picture this. You are a 13-year-old boy named Marcus standing in the marble atrium of a Roman villa in the year 96 AD. The morning sun streams through the open roof, casting geometric patterns across the polished floor. You wear a simple white tunic, and your dark hair has been carefully oiled by the household slaves. Today feels different, though you cannot understand why. The other servants move with unusual haste, their eyes avoiding yours as they prepare for visitors. From the kitchen comes the rich aroma of roasted meat and honeyed wine preparations for a feast that seems far too elaborate for an ordinary day. What you do not know is that 3 days ago, your name was written on papyrus and placed in a silver bowl. What you do not know is that the visitors are not here for business. They are here to inspect their purchase. You touch the small wooden horse in your belt, carved by your father before you were sold to pay his debts. You have kept it hidden for 2 years, a secret connection to the life you once knew. Tonight, they will find it and burn it before your eyes. The first step in erasing every trace of who you used to be. By dawn, you will understand what the older slaves meant when they whispered that some fates are worse than death. This was the reality for thousands of young men across the Roman Empire. Boys fed into a machine of exploitation that operated for centuries behind marble columns and silk curtains. The system that destroyed Marcus was not individual cruelty, but institutional design, a network of abuse that turned children into objects for Rome's elite pleasure. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you are listening from. I find it incredible that we are exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The Roman Empire controlled over 5 million square kilometers and 60 million people. But behind its architectural wonders lay a darker foundation built on human suffering. Conservative estimates suggest that over 800,000 young men served as male concubines throughout the empire's history. Their lives consumed by a system that treated human beings as renewable resources for elite entertainment. The practice was not hidden by Roman standards. Wealthy citizens openly competed to acquire the most beautiful young men, displaying them at dinner parties like living artwork. The finest specimens commanded prices equivalent to an entire year's wages for a skilled craftsman. A particularly prized boy from Greece or Egypt might cost more than a small villa, his value determined by factors that reduced human worth to a catalog of physical attributes. The true horror lay in the systematic nature of the trade. Across the empire, specialized markets operated with commercial efficiency. In Rome's slave market near the Forum, young men were displayed on raised platforms, while buyers examined their teeth, tested their reflexes, and evaluated their potential for various forms of service. Sellers maintained detailed records of each boy's origin age and previous training, treating human inventory with the same attention given to livestock. The economic incentives reached into every corner of Roman society. Poor families facing starvation could sell their sons for immediate payment, often justifying the transaction as giving their children opportunities for advancement. Raiders and pirates knew that young male captives commanded premium prices, making them priority targets during military campaigns. Even legitimate merchants supplemented their income by identifying promising boys in distant provinces and arranging their transport to urban markets. What made the Roman system particularly devastating was its integration with the empire's legal structures. Unlike common slaves who retained some basic protections under law, Male concubines occupied a gray area where their master's desires took precedence over any consideration of their welfare. They could not seek help from authorities, could not form relationships with others, and could not even own property. Their existence was defined entirely by their utility to their owners. The training process that transformed free boys into compliant concubines was as systematic as any military operation. Specialized schools operated throughout the empire, each developing techniques for breaking down resistance and creating perfect obedience. These institutions studied human psychology with scientific precision, identifying the most effective methods for destroying individual will while maintaining physical attractiveness. The geographic scope reveals the truly industrial scale. Boys were collected from Britain in the north to Egypt in the south, with different regions prized for different qualities. Celtic boys were valued for their fair complexions and fierce spirits that made their eventual submission more satisfying. Greek youths commanded high prices for their supposed intellectual refinement. Germanic captives were sought for their physical strength and exotic appearance. The transportation networks that moved these human commodities across the empire rivaled those used for grain and luxury goods. Specialized ships carried cargo holds full of chained boys across the Mediterranean, while overland routes moved smaller groups through mountain passes. The mortality rate during transport was considered acceptable overhead, factored into pricing like any other business expense. Roman literature provides disturbing glimpses into how completely this system was accepted by elite society. Poets wrote admiringly of particularly beautiful concubines. Philosophers debated proper training methods for young servants, and historians recorded the sexual preferences of emperors and generals as routine biographical details. The suffering of the boys themselves was simply invisible to a culture that viewed them as objects rather than people. The most chilling aspect was how the system created its own perpetrators. Many overseers and trainers who broke new arrivals were themselves former concubines who had survived long enough to earn positions of limited authority. Having learned that compliance offered the only path to survival, they became enthusiastic enforcers of the very system that had destroyed their own childhoods. Archaeological evidence from across the empire confirms this scale. Excavations of wealthy Roman villas regularly uncover quarters designed specifically for housing multiple young male servants, complete with chains, locks, and punishment devices. Medical instruments found at these sites suggest that surgical procedures were performed to modify the bodies of concubines according to their master's preferences. Operations conducted without modern medical knowledge or pain management. The first sign that something terrible was approaching came when Gaius Aurelius himself entered the atrium, something that had never happened during Marcus's 2 years in the household. The master typically communicated through his steward, maintaining proper distance between owner and property. But today, he walked directly to Marcus, circling him slowly, like a merchant examining a horse for purchase. Marcus had learned to stand perfectly still during inspections, keeping his eyes downcast and his breathing shallow. Movement could be interpreted as defiance, and defiance meant punishment that left marks for weeks. But this inspection felt different, more thorough and calculating than usual checks for cleanliness or grooming. Gaius lifted Marcus's chin, examining his teeth, checking his eyes for disease, running hands through the oiled hair. When he pulled back the boy's tunic to inspect his chest and shoulders, Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with morning air. The buyers arrived just after midday, their litters announcing wealth through gold fittings and silk curtains. Marcus watched from the kitchen doorway as they were welcomed into the villa's most luxurious reception room, reserved for only the most important visitors. Through the partly open door, he caught glimpses of men and expensive togas, their conversation punctuated by laughter that made his stomach clench with unnamed dread. Marcus had been sold before, when his father's farm failed and creditors demanded payment. But that transaction had been desperate necessity. Parents choosing a son's slavery over family starvation. This felt different, calculated, and commercial in a way that suggested he was not being transferred to another household, but entering something far worse. The summons came as afternoon shadows grew long. Marcus was ordered to bathe, oil his skin until it gleamed, and dress in his finest tunic, the one reserved for festivals. His hair was arranged in the Greek style that Gaius preferred, with careful curls framing his face. When he looked at his reflection in the polished bronze mirror, he saw a stranger, someone prepared for display rather than service. When Marcus entered the reception room, the conversation stopped abruptly. The buyer's 3 middle-aged men in senatorial stripes examined him with focused attention they might give to particularly fine sculpture. One gestured for him to turn slowly, allowing evaluation from every angle. Another asked him to speak, testing the quality of his voice and purity of his Latin pronunciation. The negotiation that followed treated Marcus as if he were invisible, the men discussing his qualities and potential uses while he stood motionless in the center of the room. They debated his likely endurance, speculated about his previous training, and calculated how long he might remain useful before requiring replacement. The price they settled on was higher than Marcus had ever heard for a human being, a sum that represented his complete transformation from person to luxury commodity. What Marcus did not understand was that he was being purchased not by one man, but by a consortium, 3 wealthy Romans who shared ownership of particularly expensive acquisitions. They maintained a private facility outside the city, where they kept their collection of young men, a place designed specifically for systematic exploitation. His individual worth had been calculated based on his potential to provide entertainment not just for one household, but for multiple masters and their guests. The contract signing was a formal affair with witnesses and official seals treating the transfer of a human life as routine business. Marcus watched his ownership change hands with the same legal precision used for property or livestock. In Roman law's eyes, he had just become a thing rather than a person, his entire existence reduced to terms written on papyrus scrolls. Transport happened immediately before he could process what was occurring. Chained to prevent escape, Marcus was loaded into a covered wagon alongside 3 other boys purchased from different sources. Their ages ranged from perhaps 11 to 15, and their expressions carried the same mixture of confusion and terror building in his own chest. During the journey, Marcus tried to speak with the other boys, hoping to understand where they were being taken. But the oldest boy, who had clearly been in the system longer, warned him that conversation was forbidden and would result in severe punishment for all of them. 1. They traveled in silence, each alone with his fears, as the wagon carried them toward their shared fate. The facility they reached as darkness fell was unlike anything Marcus had seen before. Built like a fortress, but decorated like a palace, it combined maximum security with luxurious appointments designed to impress visitors. High walls topped with iron spikes surrounded gardens and buildings that spoke of enormous wealth invested in a very specific purpose. This was not a simple household, but an institution, a place where systematic exploitation had been refined into an art form. The quarters where Marcus was housed bore no resemblance to normal slave accommodations. The room was luxuriously appointed with silk hangings, comfortable furniture, and even books and musical instruments. But the windows were barred, the door locked from outside, and every surface designed to prevent escape or self-harm. This was a gilded cage, beautiful enough to confuse a young mind about the nature of captivity while ensuring absolute control. Marcus soon learned that luxury was part of the conditioning process. Boys who were treated well became psychologically dependent on their captors, grateful for comfort even as they were systematically broken down. Gifts of fine clothing, good food, and small privileges created emotional bonds that made resistance difficult and compliance more likely. Training began with seemingly innocent instruction in music, poetry, and conversation. Marcus was assigned tutors who taught him to play the lyre, recite classical verses, and engage in witty dialogue on topics that would interest educated Romans. These skills were presented as opportunities for advancement, ways to make himself more valuable. Only gradually did he understand that he was being trained to be entertaining in ways that went far beyond intellectual conversation. The other boys in the facility provided Marcus with a terrifying preview of his own future. The newest arrivals still showed resistance and maintained connections to their former identities. Those who had been there longer moved with careful grace, spoke in soft voices, and displayed eagerness to please that seemed natural until you looked closely at their eyes, and the oldest boys who had survived long enough to earn small privileges served as both warnings and aspirations. Physical conditioning was integrated into daily life with subtle precision. Marcus's meals were controlled to maintain the slender build that Roman aesthetics preferred. His skin was treated with oils to keep it soft and unmarked. His hair was styled to emphasize youth and beauty, and he was taught to move his body in ways that would please observers. The psychological techniques used to break down resistance were more sophisticated than simple brutality. Marcus was subjected to constant uncertainty about rules and expectations, creating chronic anxiety that made him eager to comply with any clear instruction. He was isolated from supportive relationships, while being rewarded for emotional dependence on his captors. Most insidiously, he was gradually convinced that his previous life had been worthless, and his current situation represented improvement. Sleep became a weapon in this psychological war. Marcus was awakened at irregular intervals for training sessions or inspections, preventing the rest necessary for mental clarity. Exhaustion made him more susceptible to suggestion and less capable of maintaining emotional defenses against systematic erosion of his identity. The facility operated according to complex schedules that maximized psychological impact while ensuring boys were always prepared for potential use. Marcus never knew when he might be summoned for inspection training or actual service. This constant anticipation created chronic stress that gradually wore down his ability to maintain hope for escape or rescue. Punishment for infractions was designed to be memorable without leaving visible marks that would reduce market value. Boys who showed resistance might be confined in spaces too small to lie down, forced to stand motionless for hours, or subjected to sensory deprivation that left them desperate for human contact. The psychological impact often proved more effective than physical violence in creating compliance. The most disturbing aspect was how the system corrupted normal human relationships. Boys were encouraged to inform on each other's infractions in exchange for small privileges, creating mutual suspicion that prevented supportive bonds. Friendships were discouraged, and any signs of romantic attachment between boys were ruthlessly suppressed through separation or punishment. Marcus watched other boys change during his time in training, their personalities shifting as they adapted to survive. The confident Greek boy who had arrived shortly before him gradually became submissive and eager to please. The defiant Germanic youth who had initially fought every instruction slowly developed the soft voice and downcast eyes that marked complete psychological surrender. The breaking point came not through violence, but through carefully orchestrated false hope, followed by crushing disappointment. Marcus was told that his performance had been so exemplary that he was being considered for a special assignment that might lead to eventual freedom. He spent days preparing for this opportunity, allowing himself to believe that his nightmare might soon end, when the truth was revealed that the special assignment was actually his first full service to a client. The psychological impact was devastating. The hope that had sustained him through months of conditioning was revealed as just another tool used to manipulate his emotions. The boy who had believed he might still escape finally understood that resistance was not just futile, but had never been a real possibility. The first client was a senator named Lucius Cornelius, a man whose public reputation for virtue and family values provided perfect cover for his private appetites. He arrived at the facility with casual confidence of someone inspecting property he already owned, examining Marcus with the same attention he might give to a new horse or piece of artwork. The boy who had once carved wooden toys with his father was now being evaluated like livestock by one of Rome's most respected politicians. Marcus had been prepared for this moment through months of conditioning, but no training could have readied him for the reality of complete objectification. Lucius treated him not as a human being, but as an animated object, something that existed solely to provide pleasure and entertainment. The conversation during their encounter was conducted as if Marcus were not present, with Lucius commenting on his qualities and performance to invisible observers. The physical aspects were painful and degrading, but the psychological impact cut deeper. Marcus had been trained to respond appropriately, to show enthusiasm for his own exploitation, to express gratitude for treatment that violated every natural instinct. The most horrifying realization was that his training had been successful, that his body and voice were producing expected responses, even as his mind recoiled from what was happening. After Lucius left, Marcus was returned to his quarters for recovery and preparation for the next client. The facility operated with industrial efficiency, managing multiple boys and clients simultaneously while maintaining the illusion of luxury and exclusivity. Boys were scheduled like appointments, their availability tracked on scrolls that reduced human lives to calendar entries. The clients who visited represented a cross-section of Roman elite society. Military commanders took breaks from campaigns to sample newest acquisitions. Wealthy merchants celebrated successful deals by purchasing time with favorite boys. Even respected philosophers and poets, men who wrote eloquently about virtue and human dignity, regularly visited to indulge appetites they would never acknowledge in public. Marcus began to understand that he was serving not just individual perverts, but an entire system of exploitation that reached into every level of Roman society. The facility was not an aberration, but a logical extension of an empire built on the principle that power entitled its holders to unlimited access to the bodies and lives of those beneath them. The psychological toll of repeated exploitation accumulated like poison. Each encounter reinforced his status as an object rather than a person. Each client demonstrated that his suffering was invisible to those who used him. Each day confirmed that escape was impossible and rescue would never come. The boy who had once dreamed of freedom gradually stopped believing that such a concept could apply to someone like him. Some boys broke completely under this treatment, retreating into madness or catatonia that made them useless for their intended purpose. These were quietly disposed of, their bodies buried in unmarked graves, while new acquisitions took their places. The facility maintained careful records of which boys remained viable and which had outlived their usefulness, treating human psychological collapse as predictable business expense. Marcus survived by developing what modern psychology would recognize as dissociative responses, mentally separating himself from his physical experiences while his body performed required actions. He learned to observe his own exploitation from a distance, as if watching someone else endure what was happening to him. This psychological splitting allowed him to maintain a fragment of sanity, but at the cost of losing connection to his own humanity. The hierarchy within the facility meant that boys who survived long enough could earn privileges and even limited authority over newer arrivals. Some embraced these opportunities, becoming enthusiastic enforcers of the same system that had destroyed their own childhoods. Marcus watched in horror as boys he had known transformed into predators themselves, using their knowledge of the conditioning process to help break down fresh victims. As Marcus entered his second year at the facility, he began to notice physical changes that marked his approaching obsolescence. The boyish features that had made him valuable were maturing into those of a young man, reducing his appeal to clients who preferred specific aesthetics of youth. His handlers began discussing his future in terms that made clear his time as premium commodity was ending. The transition from active service to disposal was managed with the same efficiency that characterized every aspect of the facility's operations. Boys who aged out of prime usefulness were typically sold to lower-tier establishments where they would serve less wealthy clients under increasingly harsh conditions. Some were castrated to preserve their youthful appearance, a surgical modification that often resulted in death, but occasionally extended commercial viability. Marcus learned that the average lifespan of a boy in the system was approximately 4 years from initial capture to final disposal. Disease suicide and simple wear from repeated exploitation claimed most victims long before they could age out naturally. The few who survived to adulthood typically died within months of leaving the facility, their bodies and minds too damaged to function in any other environment. When Marcus finally contracted the wasting disease that killed many boys in the facility, he accepted it gratefully as liberation from an existence that had become unendurable. During his final weeks, as fever consumed his body and delirium clouded his mind, Marcus sometimes imagined he could hear his father calling his name across the hills of Gaul. In these moments, he remembered the feeling of sunlight on his face and the satisfaction of work that served a purpose beyond others' pleasure. Marcus died on a cold morning in early spring, his body discovered by guards making routine inspection. His death was recorded in the facility's ledgers with the same clinical notation used for all such events. Inventory reduced by 1 unit replacement required from current stock. The boy whose wooden horses had once galloped across imaginary battlefields was disposed of like broken furniture. The ledger that recorded Marcus's death was discovered 16 centuries later by archaeologists excavating the ruins of what had once been Rome's most exclusive facility for male concubines. The dry notation of his final disposal was surrounded by thousands of similar entries, each representing a young life consumed by a system that operated with bureaucratic precision in the service of unspeakable cruelty. Modern forensic analysis of the burial site revealed evidence that confirmed historical accounts of systematic abuse. The skeletal remains showed signs of malnutrition, physical trauma, and stress patterns consistent with chronic psychological torture. Many bodies bore evidence of surgical modifications performed without modern medical knowledge procedures designed to enhance commercial value at the cost of humanity. The most chilling discovery was the scale revealed by archaeological evidence. The facility had processed an estimated 3,000 boys during its century of operation, making it just one node in a network that spanned the entire Roman Empire. Conservative estimates suggest that over 200 similar institutions operated throughout Roman territory, consuming human lives at a rate that challenges modern comprehension. The client records found in sealed chambers provided names that shocked classical historians. Senators, generals, philosophers, and even some early Christian leaders appeared on lists of regular visitors. Their public personas of virtue serving as perfect camouflage for private appetites that fed on children's suffering. The hypocrisy was not accidental, but systematic, with public morality serving as cover for private monstrosities. The financial records revealed the true scope of economic incentives driving this trade. The facility generated profits that funded everything from military campaigns to public works projects. Its success measured in architectural marvels built with money earned from systematic torture of young men. The Pantheon itself was partly financed with gold earned from human suffering, its magnificent dome standing as eternal monument to the cost of Roman grandeur. Archaeological evidence suggests that the facility operated until the mid-2nd century AD, when changing social attitudes finally made such blatant exploitation more difficult to maintain publicly. But rather than ending the trade, these changes simply drove it further underground, creating a shadow economy that continued to consume young lives while maintaining plausible deniability. The fate of Marcus, recorded in a single line of Latin text, was multiplied thousands of times in ledgers that documented the facility's operations. Each entry represented not just statistical death, but destruction of an individual human being who had possessed hopes and dreams before being fed into a machine designed to transform children into profit. Marcus was one of an estimated 800,000 young men who suffered this fate across 5 centuries of Roman imperial dominance. The system that destroyed him operated in every major city of the empire, consuming young lives to feed appetites that Roman society not only tolerated but actively protected through legal and social structures. The business model that enabled this systematic abuse has never truly disappeared. Today, an estimated 27 million people live in conditions of modern slavery, with children representing more than a quarter of these victims. The methods have evolved, and terminology has changed, but the fundamental dynamic remains identical. Powerful individuals exploiting vulnerable populations, while society maintains carefully constructed ignorance. The same psychological techniques used in Roman facilities appear in contemporary trafficking operations. The same economic incentives continue to fuel modern exploitation. The same social mechanisms that allowed Roman elites to maintain respectability while consuming human lives operate today in institutions that profit from systematic abuse while maintaining plausible deniability. We remember Marcus not as a statistic in Roman commerce ledgers, but as a human being who deserved protection and love. His wooden horse, carved by loving hands, and burned by guards who saw only obstacle to efficient conditioning, represents everything lost when societies choose profit over compassion. Next time we journey to medieval Europe to uncover darker truths about religious institutions that claim to serve God while systematically destroying children placed in their care. Make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss these forgotten stories that history tried to bury.